I love traveling, but border crossings always make me nervous. The glossy travel magazines barely hint at passports and visas, while I usually seem to be confronted by an array of officials asking questions I'm not prepared to answer. Once, in a tin-roofed shack outside of Karanga, Malawi, a health inspector barely glanced at my yellow fever vaccination certificate before asking, "Are you married?" When I said no, he asked, "Why not?" What kind of question is that? I stammered out something about not having met the right man, and he allowed me into the country. But the truth of the matter is that I have nothing against marriage, but I have a problem with weddings. Now, the glossy bridal magazines show pristine white gowns, perfectly matched bridesmaids, elaborately arranged flowers. Weddings in my family do not work that way. Consider my cousin Larry. He's a fan of Japanese animation and Star Trek. He and his bride had a lovely ceremony conducted by an officiant wearing a kimono and Mr. Spock ears, who bade the happy couple to live long and prosper. His sister Susan had never been all that good at arithmetic, but even she should have understood it was questionable to ask her 3.5-month pregnant future sister-in-law to be the matron of honor at a wedding to be held in 5 months. And then there's poor Aunt Sylvia. She would have saved herself the cost of a plane ticket from St. Louis and many, many thousands of hours of therapy had she only thought to ask Mark and Janet what it meant on their invitation when it said that the reception, to be held on a Northern California beach, was clothing optional. At least my cousins were creative. All of the weddings I went to when I was growing up were pretty much the same. They were held in a back room of Lou G. Siegel's kosher restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. Before the ceremony, there were drinks and hors d'oeuvres, which meant that one leg of an L-shaped table had a bowl of mildly alcoholic punch, while the longer leg had chafing dishes of miniature egg rolls and franks and blankets arranged on either side of a large swan carved out of chopped liver. When it was time for the actual ceremony, the 4 tallest teenage boys were recruited to hold the poles of the chuppah, the wedding canopy. The groom entered, and then the bride entered to whispers about how well her off-white suit would do for future years of Hadassah luncheons. Uncle Murray, who had ignored the punch in favor of his personal flask of Slivovitz, called out each of the blessings just about half a beat before the rabbi. Finally, the ceremony ended with the groom stepping on the glass. Well, actually, we used a light bulb because they're much easier to break and make a more convincing sound. And we went off to a reception where we ate fancy foods like rock Cornish hen and wild rice, and everything with dancing in between courses, and everything concluded with a Viennese table of desserts being rolled in, and Cousin David, who would have been known as the Jewish Elvis had the payola scandals broken a little bit later, came in and sang Sunrise, Sunset before we all scurried home. Another thing was the same at all of those weddings. The groom was always my grandfather. See, my grandmother had died back in Europe, and Grandpa remarried for the first time shortly before coming to the US. It was not a happy marriage, and they were separated as far back as anybody could remember. When New York State liberalized their divorce laws, Grandpa was quick to take advantage of that, and he enjoyed a few weeks of eager dancing at the Roseland Ballroom, but it wasn't long before he announced he was getting married again. A dozen different women called our house asking, "Is it true Leo's getting married? I'm so disappointed." And one even sued him for breach of promise. His third wife made a strategic error in relocating them to Florida. With a healthy supply of eligible widows, Grandpa was in his element. And it wasn't long before there was another divorce. But it wasn't much after that one night I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my homework, and not quite listening as my father was talking to Grandpa in Yiddish. And then Dad's vocabulary must have deserted him because I heard him say in English, "Pa, you don't have to marry her. In America, they call it shacking up." But Grandpa did go on to marry again, and, well, I lost track after 5. There was one wedding when I was growing up that was different. My aunt brought shame and disgrace on the family by marrying a man who was not Jewish. There was a lot of debate about whether or not we should attend the wedding, and finally, the family reached a compromise. We could attend as long as we agreed not to have any fun. 300 exuberant Italians, mixed family, ate lasagna, drank champagne, and danced the tarantella, while we sat in a corner eating frozen kosher TV dinners and drinking ginger ale until the band played a token round of Hava Nagila. With all of this background, you can imagine how I felt when my brother announced that he was getting married. Now, Elliot and Ramona had lived together for 8 years, but they planned the whole wedding in 3 weeks on the grounds that every day of delay would double the cost of the festivities. This had a few consequences. The only bride and groom dolls they could find for the cake had red hair, so I arrived to see my mother sitting at the kitchen table with model airplane paint, correcting the hair on the dolls. The justice of the peace they had hired had contracted the flu, so Elliot was busy briefing the substitute judge on how the ceremony would go, but nobody else could understand how his stereo system worked. So Ramona ended up walking down the aisle to the salsa station on the radio. Still, it was a lovely wedding, and it wasn't long before they set off on their Disneyland honeymoon. My taste in travel is a little bit more exotic, and a couple of months later, I found myself on a train crossing from Naushki, Russia, to Sukhbatar, Mongolia. One of the border agents, I think it was the insurance inspector, asked me how it was that I was traveling with 3 men I was not related to. Wasn't I married? All I could do was think that, I'm sure marriage is a lovely country, but that border crossing is just a little too difficult. Thank you.